NATO is poking the bear, the Russian bear, risking war with NATO. Now, listen, there's times when it makes sense to push back on Russia like it does with nearly anybody, sometimes even your friends. So just poking the bear by itself is not necessarily an egregious sin. But when it's an unnecessary poking and it could prompt us to get into a conflict that we do not need to fight, that we cannot win at an acceptable cost, and that would give us no benefit whatsoever to fight, wage, or win even, then it turns into a real problem. We're going to talk about that today, and we got nobody better to help us unpack this than Colonel Jacques Baud, friend of our show here, a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, former NATO officer, and just a tremendous analyst of these kinds of things, understands the Russian mentality very good. So it's terrific insight to have. Welcome back to the show, Colonel.
Thank you for having me back in the show. Thank you, and hello to everybody.
Really good to have you back again here. And I know a lot of our fans are big fans of yours because apparently you do a lot of stuff in your old language there, and not as much in English. So a lot of people really look forward to having you on our show here, and we definitely do.
Yes.
So thanks for coming back.
Yes, that's true.
Let's get into this, to the thesis here of what NATO's doing. Now, I think it's fair to say that the purpose of NATO is to actually keep us out of conflict. And I actually heard Jens Stoltenberg earlier this very day talk about how it's NATO's primary objective is to have a deterrence. And who's to argue with that categorically? That is what we're supposed to do, to prevent war, not to seek one to go out and fight. But it seems like the way we've been going about it for quite some time, not quite an effective way. How do you see it just generally?
Well, generally speaking, first of all, I think we have to be careful here to make a distinction between NATO and NATO countries. For instance, when we talk about France sending troops or willing to send troops to Ukraine, it's a NATO country. It doesn't mean that the troops that will be sent by France will be under NATO command. I think it's important to say because we tend very often in the West to mix up things. And what we have seen in the past months that the different countries, France is one, but there are other ones like Slovakia, Czechia, and so on, they have signed bilateral agreements with Ukraine for help or eventually send troops maybe, and so on. So if that's important to make the distinction, because when we talk about NATO, we talk about US. When we talk about NATO using nuclear weapons, for instance, we're talking about US. So that's important because in the NATO, the one that in fact decides in reality is the US. And while if it's about sending troops or sending equipment or whatever, then it's a bilateral question. And by the way, that illustrates the fact that having countries wanting to send troops and other countries, such as Italy, for instance, not willing to send troops to Ukraine, and even being against the use of the weapons provided to Ukraine for inside the Russian territory. So that means that in fact, there is not much unity within NATO itself in reality. So even if sometimes even Jens Stoltenberg said that NATO came out as reinforced in this Ukrainian crisis, it's not exactly true, because what we see, on the contrary, is a lot of divisions in the way individual countries understand the role of NATO. So as a result, we have to be very careful in the way we use the word NATO in that context. I prefer to use NATO countries, because then we have countries such as France, which is rather unpredictable, because Emmanuel Macron says one thing one day and another thing the other day. So you never know exactly what he has in mind, and probably nothing, just wind. But
right. And also related to that, to your comment a second ago, you had the president of the United States, Joe Biden, on Saturday, this past Saturday, emphasized in a speech to the West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, that he has no intention of any American troops fighting a war in Russia. So at least I'm glad he says that part there. But then but there's lots of other doors that he leaves open, which is really, I think, part of the problem that I've discussed before. And again, just before we went on air here, there doesn't seem to be any real riven strategic imperative or so that guides the various operational actions or everything else around which everything is tied, which is supposed to be the way international relations are done among mature nations. But we don't seem to be doing that.
Well, that's true, and you see, for instance, if you just take this example of Blinken pushing Biden to end the ban on the Ukraine use of U.S. weapons. Lifting the ban means that there was a ban at one point, but for some reason, the U.S. In fact shifts gear and changes its mind. And that, in fact, reflects the whole approach of the West in this conflict, because we see that in 2022 and even 2022 was no intention whatsoever to send U.S. Battle tanks to Ukraine or to send fighters like F-16 and so on, and all these red lines that were set by Western countries. They set those red lines for themselves, and eventually they crossed the same red lines that they defined for themselves. So we see that we have a completely erratic leadership and strategic understanding of the situation. And that makes, in fact, the situation, in my view, quite dangerous, not because of Vladimir Putin, but because we are not able to have a consistent approach, exactly as was you just said. We are not able to have a consistent approach to what we want to achieve. And by the way, you had a Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, recently. He was audited by the Senate Committee of the Armed Forces. And one of the senators, I don't remember which one, asked him to define victory for Ukraine. And Austin was not even able to articulate what could be victory in the conflict in Ukraine. Meaning that this guy, who leads, is the highest position in the U.S. military, beside the president, of course. But I mean, he has the highest position. He is the overview of everything that happens in Ukraine, and this guy is not even able to articulate what could be victory. That means that this guy has absolutely no objective for what he is doing in Ukraine, and having no objective, he cannot have a strategy, because a strategy is about how you reach your objective. So if you don't have objective, you don't have a strategy. And that's exactly the point. That's exactly the problem we are facing in the West. And we have also to understand that this whole conflict is, in fact, masterminded by the US since the very beginning. The Europeans have done sometimes more. They have been more royalists than the king, so to say. So they have been more extreme than the US. But basically, they are following what the U.S. has decided in that
right, which is kind of scary. Gary, I'm just wondering, do you happen to have that video, the one he's talking about there? We've used it before.
So what does victory look like for Ukraine? Yeah. How do you define victory?
You may have heard me say this earlier, Senator, but we've said from the very beginning that what we want to see is a Ukraine that's a democratic country that has that is independent and has the ability to protect its sovereign territory, to defend its sovereign territory, and to deter aggression.
Does that mean Crimea is part of Ukraine?
Crimea is a part of Ukraine.
Well, okay, right. But in order for the war to be over, does Ukraine have to control Crimea?
In terms of how things transition going forward, I would not want to predict what President Zelensky will will decide?
I think part of the problem, with all due respect, is that this administration has not articulated what an exit strategy is. To me, this is a blank check for a war that, without any clearly defined goals, will be endless.
Well, couldn't have put it better myself. Yeah, I knew, Gary. Good job on pulling that up there. I knew that you'd be able to grab that one, but that just graphically shows, even more painfully than you articulated, what it actually looks like in real life.
This is tragic, and it's extremely embarrassing. I mean, if I were American, but I can share this embarrassment for you with you if you want, because in fact, what we're witnessing here, you find exactly the same throughout the Western leadership, because you will find no other leader in Europe who is able to articulate a sound and consistent strategy to address the problem of Ukraine. And we see that right with this peace conference. I mean, we are, and that happens in my country, in Switzerland, by the way, in June, that you have this peace conference that will address, or should address, the 10 points from peace formula of Zelensky, which is basically a capitulation declaration for Russia. Okay, so we know that this plan, or this formula, as it is called, is totally disconnected for any reality and any reality on the ground. So that means that they started this conference based on that. Now, since even Joe Biden is not attending, and other leaders will not attend this conference, now they realize that probably this conference is totally misguided. So now they try to reduce the number of the 10 points plan of Zelensky into 3 points, because they see that it's doomed to fail, and it will fail. So we are here in a situation that we just throw ideas on the table, but we don't know how we want to implement that.
Yeah, I'm going to actually come back to that in just a second, because I have some other sound that I want to share with you on that very topic here. But there's something else I want to show you that actually feeds to what you just said there about it. Just seems like we're throwing stuff up on the wall to see what's going to happen. Here, I believe a couple of days ago, is a retired U.S. General Schwartz, who's talking about maybe sending some trainers into NATO. Into Ukraine. Maybe that'll help. Here's how he put it.
General Brown, who said that, sending military trainers to Ukraine is an inevitable. So there's obviously been some very high level discussions between the Defense Department and the executive branch of the U.S. government regarding the ask that has been, longstanding by Ukraine to provide more training and advisory support to the Ukraine military. I think also, just given the number of casualties that Ukraine has suffered, that the fewer service members that they have tied up in their training institutions, and they can leverage, the United States and other members of the alliance, will only, help Ukraine not only with throughput, but also keeping experience on the front lines versus back in the training centers.
Now, here's one reason I wanted to bring that up specifically for you, because I know that you're like an expert on the systems of military and how systems function, et cetera. And he's talking about how having trainers in Ukraine is going to help throughput, like somehow that's the problem. But Colonel, didn't we see like a lot more of this training, whether it was physically on the ground in Ukraine or elsewhere, like a lot more of it prior to 2023, and it had almost no impact at all? What's going to be different this time?
Well, absolutely. It was this training was even counterproductive, because even the Ukrainian officers and Ukrainian soldiers complained that the training they received in France or in Germany or in the UK, that this training was definitely not adapted to the kind of warfare that is waged in Ukraine. And that is almost self-explanatory, because all these armies, the UK, France, and Germany, and Germany probably a little bit less, but France and UK, what is the experience in the last 30 years? These guys have fought wars in Northern Africa, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. It's a totally different type of warfare against an enemy which is under equipped, underarmed, and where you don't have any aviation, I mean, Air Force, for
Yeah.
instance. So, the kind of warfare you wage in such situation is totally different. And in fact, the problem we have, and that was already noted by the Ukrainian themselves,
Right.
that the training they receive doesn't help to integrate the Ukrainian system, so to say. On the contrary, it brings different doctrine, different understanding of war, and that's definitely not what is needed on the ground. Even weapons are not even adapted to the kind of warfare they're waging. I mean, I'm not even the Leopard 2 tanks, which is quite a good tank. I mean, I used to lead a battalion of such years ago, and it's a very fine weapon, but it's not adapted to the level of combat integration you have today with the T90M and then T90MS and the whole what the Russian called the reconnaissance strike complex. And this is the kind of integration of the reconnaissance, fire, and command into one system. And the problem is, that's the problem. It's not the training of individuals. The Ukrainian soldiers know probably very well how to fight, probably even NCOs and junior officers. The problem is not there. The problem is, how do you, this is the more the operational level and the strategic level which is lacking, in fact. So how do you train these people? How can we manage? It's not even training questions. How can we manage to create that system? And we see that there is no system, because the way the Russian can manage to isolate troops, to combat individual, they have the Ukrainians, for instance, are no longer able to use their Air Force. They are no longer able to use their artillery efficiently because of the Russian electronic countermeasures. So, meaning that the effort of the Russians has been to disrupt what is left in terms of command and control of the Ukrainians. And that's the reason why the Russians are successful, because they have a consistent and coherent war machine against a machine that is, in fact, a patchwork of individual equipment coming from the Cold War, from the Soviet, from the West, and so on and so forth.
All just mashed up together and just hope it works, and let's do some throughput, whatever. Yeah. And then when you're talking about now forced mobilization of thousands of people that don't want to fight, that aren't qualified to fight, and you've lost so many of those that had them in the training, it's just a path you can never catch up to, even on that term. But that doesn't seem to deter many in the West, because Jens Stoltenberg just hours ago, just this very day, is talking about as though all those things don't matter, and this war will just continue to go on for years to come with no problem, when he said this.
I have also proposed a multi-year financial pledge, meaning that we should agree as NATO allies a financial pledge to Ukraine over several years, to ensure that we prevent gaps and delays, as we have seen recently, and that Ukraine gets predictable, accountable support for the long haul, and that's what they need to prevail as a sovereign, independent nation.
But is that what they need? Predictable cash? Is that going to keep them a sovereign nation?
Well, it's not a question of cash and all that. I mean, we have the example of a conflict in Gaza where you have Palestinians with no weapons, with very little financial support, with very little resources, but still being able to keep the very mighty IDF at bay, and even to defeat, to some extent, Israel. The reason why the Palestinians can reach that result is that because they have an approach, a doctrine, a terrain, a weaponry, and an approach to the conflict that matches exactly the conditions in which they are fighting. That's exactly the problem. They have exactly what is needed to fight. On the contrary, the Israeli, despite their technological advance, the mighty equipment they may have, the tanks, the artillery, and all that, they have an equipment which is not suited for the kind of warfare which is waged in Gaza. Again, the Israeli have a problem of consistency. And again, the consistency is not just the command and control, but the force you have needs to be adequate for the kind of terrain of warfare that you are waging. The IDF is designed to fight in kind of open warfare, if you want, but not this kind of warfare. So we have exactly the same in Ukraine. So it's not a question of resources. It's a question of how you make what you have consistent with the way you act. That's the key of the problem. Now, Stoltenberg reacts as a bureaucrat. He reacts as a bureaucrat because he thinks that the whole thing will help Ukraine to continue the war. Now, the paradox is that the Russians have understood that. And they have understood that in summer 2022. At this point, as the West started to provide weapons to Ukraine, the Russians have understood that regardless of how many equipment and how much equipment they destroyed, the West will come and provide new equipment to Ukraine. As a result, this is exactly the time point in which the Ukraine shift their strategy from a more aggressive posture. They decided to have this kind of aggressive attrition strategy, and that's exactly what General Surovikin said on the 28th of October 2022. He said, from now on, we'll no longer make big arrow or big offensive on the map, but we will destroy, we will let the enemy come and we destroy it systematically. And that's exactly what they are doing. And now we are, in fact, by providing all this equipment and the support, exactly what Stoltenberg described, is in fact exactly the same strategy as the one the West started to implement in the summer 2022. And on the other hand, that serves the Russian strategy. And now the Russians have understood that they don't need to have big operation. Now they have to destroy systematically the Russian potential, the Ukrainian potential, and eventually the only solution, since the West doesn't want to negotiate or whatever, then the solution for the Russians is just to destroy Ukraine. And that's exactly what they will implement. This is the systematic destruction of Ukraine. And
in that regard, does it almost seems to me that because we're waging a different kind of war than the Russians are, that comments like this from Stoltenberg about let's just keep giving them enough stuff, let's have this long sustained program over years, is going to do nothing but just feed more Ukrainians into this meat grinder.
Exactly. This is exactly that. So this is a paradox, and I think that was underlined by Vladimir Putin recently, because in fact there is a convergence between what the West is doing and what the Russians want to achieve. I mean, the Russians have understood that Ukraine must be totally powerless, must be totally annihilated, if you want, and the Europeans or the West is just pushing Ukraine towards this total annihilation. So the Europeans have not, I mean, the West, not just Europeans. The US is also a partner in crime
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that in that,
Right.
that thing. But the thing is that the West has not understood that everything they are doing now works against Ukraine, not against Russia. And that's the paradox of things. The more they help Ukraine, the more they push Ukraine towards total
Okay, so
destruction.
is this in your professional military assessment what we see playing out on a microcosm north of Kharkiv right now? Because you had, I believe it was Forbes magazine came out recently. The Institute for the Study of War have said, "Oh, look at this big disaster for the Russians. They had this big offensive north of Kharkiv, and it broke down after barely 10 kilometers." And it's a complete disaster now. The Ukraine side has rushed a bunch of reinforcements up there, and they're trying from counterattacks, and that just shows how weak the Russians are. But from another perspective, it's like that's all Russia intended to do for the time being, was to go that far in there in order to draw reserves up to destroy them. How do you see it?
No, this is exactly that. This is exactly that. And by the way, that was explained by Russian military experts. And this is exactly the point. The Russians, they want to, and that was already said by General Surovikin in October 2022, they want to spare the life of their own soldiers. That means they will not go into bold action through Ukraine and things like that. They just want to spare their own lives. They will save their own soldiers, but they want to destroy the Ukrainian potential. That's the reason why they don't need to proceed at high speed. They don't want to conquer Ukraine. That's very important. The problem is that in the West, we have difficulty to understand that victory can only be achieved by gaining territory. That's the first thing. And B, that the Russians are seeking to gain territory in Ukraine. And again, we have to come back to the objectives that were set by Vladimir Putin on the 24th of February 2022. He said the purpose of this operation is to demilitarize. So, meaning that's the destruction of a potential. It's not gaining territory. So, in fact, while the Ukrainians try to defend territory, the Russians don't care about territory. They just want to destroy potential. And that's
Okay.
it's a kind of,
Let me
sorry.
ask you a question here. Now, in just a second, I'm going to shift back to that peace summit in Switzerland you're talking about there a second ago. We're going to go into some detail on that. But first, I want to look at the other side of that equation, because we had Vladimir Putin, who is clearly on the advantage militarily, whether it's manpower, firepower, air defense, engineering capacity. I mean, in nearly every category, ammunition supply, all of those categories makes it very clear that the Ukraine side can never hope to win in attrition warfare now or later. That's obvious. So with Russia on the advantage, if they truly wanted to conquer all of Ukraine, or wanted to do what some of these other people talk about in Europe, with these wild fantasies about that Russia wants to actually take over a bunch of NATO countries too, why then would he say of his own initiative last week that he's still willing to negotiate a peace deal given current realities where they are right now?
Well, that was always the center point of the Russian strategy is negotiation, in fact. This has always been. Remember that the Russians were the ones who insisted on the implementation of the Minsk agreement. Each time Volodymyr Zelensky asked for negotiation, that was already on the 25th of February 2022. The Russians said yes. When Zelensky came back on the 25th, on mid-March 2022, the Russians said also yes for negotiation. And even in August 2022, I think it was the 18th of August 2022, in Lvov, Erdogan proposed a summit to negotiate a negotiation directly between Zelensky and Putin said yes. So the Russians were always in favor of negotiation. And if you look at the polls in Russia, it's also interesting to see that you have roughly between 50 and 60% of the population, which is still in favor of negotiation. But at the same time, the same population, I mean, the same Russian population, at 75% is in favor of the military operation. So meaning that it's sometimes it seems a paradox, but they feel that it's necessary to have a military action, and that they were obliged, they were constrained to go into military action. But at the same time, if there is any a signal of willingness on the Western side and the Ukrainian side to find a honest negotiation, the Russians say, that's fine, we'll go. The problem is that today, the Russians have experienced 3 times, on the 3 occasions, February 2022, March 2022, and August 2022, on the 3 occasions, the Ukrainians proposed a negotiation, and on 3 occasions, the Westerners, and namely the European Union in February 2022, the Brits, the French and the German in March 2022, and Boris Johnson again in August 2022, they came and said, stop, we don't want a negotiation. And by the way, we have at the same time, we have this peace conference announced in Switzerland. At the same time, you have the British Ministry of Defense, Jacques, who said there should be no deal between Kiev and Moscow. So we see that again, we are here with the total absence of a strategy. We are still
because we have the total absence of leadership. Nobody has a vision of a leader that can bring all of these people into path to go somewhere that makes sense. So instead, you have all these people doing what seems right in their own eyes, and you have chaos.
That's exactly that. And there is absolutely no. Well, that was in. Yes, that was in March. I mean, the picture you have, I think, is in March. But you had almost the same picture in August 2022. Well, Boris Johnson also came and said it's not the time for flimsy agreements and deals with the Russians. So this shows the total inconsistent approach to this conflict.
Okay, and now then let's shift over.
Yep,
so here we have Russia desiring and emphatically saying they want to have a negotiated settlement to end the war. So that's one side. Now then we have this other side where there is the image of a desire to negotiate on the side of the West in the Ukraine. But I want you to explain to us what this really is, because it doesn't seem like it's what it appears. Here was, by the way, President Biden, we had this headline up there a second ago, has announced that he doesn't have any plans to come to this because, well, he's got to go make some cash in Hollywood and meet some cool stars, even though he's coming right out of the G7, which is the day after. He can't even delay it that far. Apparently, it's that not important to him. And then you have Zelensky trying to shame him back in by making what can only be called a campaign commercial. Check this out.
I'm appealing to the leaders of the world who are still aside of the global efforts of the Global Peace Summit. To President Biden, the leader of the United States, and to President Xi, the leader of China. We do not want the UN Charter to be burned down just like these books. And I hope you don't want to either.
So let me first of all ask your opinion. What do you think is going to be the response in, we'll say, Beijing, forget about Washington for the moment, that Vladimir Zelensky is going to be able to shame Chairman Xi Jinping into coming to the summit against his growing strategic partner of Vladimir Putin? What do you think when he sees something like this?
Well, it's a kind of paradox, because China came up in 2022, with a project of a peace framework for Ukraine. And it was snubbed by the West. And nobody wanted to hear that because, of course, the West doesn't want to hear about a deal and even peace because they wanted this victory, this decisive victory against Russia. Today, the problem is a little bit different because they see that this peace or this victory will not be achieved, and they find an exit strategy. So now they are begging China to come and help. It's it's just a illustration of the weakness of the West in that. And of course, the Chinese, they say very rightly that if you want a peace agreement or a peace conference, then you need to have all the parties around the table. If you don't have the Russians, there is no point having a peace conference. So I don't know what will eventually be the response in terms of the Chinese presence. But I think Xi Jinping will not attend the conference in Switzerland.
Okay, yeah, and I'm actually going to get to that in a second because China's been saying some other things here lately. But let's stay with this, the peace summit, so called, in Switzerland here. What is it with it, since it's not even inviting Russia? I mean, I'm actually saying this is a legitimate question. What is the point of it? What are what is Switzerland itself, the country that apparently has agreed to host this? What does Ukraine hope to accomplish to bring this summit to fruition so that it can get? Now, I'll show you one clue here that Zelensky himself says what he's trying to accomplish. And then I'd like you to explain what you think is really going on. Watch this.
Putin not only wants to disrupt the peace summit and tries to do a lot for this purpose, but he is also afraid of what the summit can bring. The world is capable of forcing Russia into peace and into compliance with international security norms.
So on what planet does Volodymyr Zelensky or all of these other 70 countries that apparently are coming think that they can force Russia into a peace agreement as a result of this agreement? I truly don't understand.
No, me neither. I mean, this is totally delusional. In addition to that, if we look at the peace plan or the peace formula, and I can show you here what the West wants to consider. This is the peace plan that was designed by Zelensky in the summer, fall 2022. And it was presented first in September 22 at the UN General Assembly in the form of a 5-point plan. And then this plan with a 10-point plan was presented in November 22. But the interesting thing, I don't want to go through all the different points. Each point is more or less based on a resolution of the United Nations. So there's no real point to discuss each point. But the interesting thing is that this plan, as it is put together, is basically a capitulation declaration for Russia.
Well, yeah, point number 6 alone is never going to happen to the side that's winning the war.
No, exactly. This is exactly the point. But the thing is, we have to remember that this plan was designed as, you have to remember that in July 2022, Zelensky and General Zaluzhny promised to have a big counteroffensive with 1 million men. And they pledged to recruit and to build up an army of 1 million men with Western equipment and all that, and to wage this counteroffensive. Eventually, they didn't manage to do it in fall 2022. They didn't manage to have it in winter 2022. And eventually, this is the counteroffensive we saw in June 2023. But the thing is that the plan itself, this 10-point plan, was designed before this fantastic counteroffensive. So at this point in time, the West didn't contemplate anything else than a defeat from Russia, because it was so much expected from that counteroffensive that nothing else than a defeat could emerge from that counteroffensive. And that's exactly what we had in, at this point in time. The problem is that since 2022, we still have the same 10 points plan, which is presented. It was discussed in Copenhagen in 2022. Then it was discussed in Jeddah in August 2022. Then in Malta. And in Malta, it was decided, the Swiss promised to organize a first peace conference, because the exactly same peace conference as the one that will happen in June happened, in fact, in January this year, just before the World Economic Forum in Davos. And at that point, this was exactly the same point that was presented to the attendees of the World Economic Forum. And this conference had no success. No surprise, because the Russians were not present, and they decided to repeat this exercise in June, and that's exactly what will happen in June. And now, of course, they especially, and I think that's the purpose of the visit of Antony Blinken to Kiev recently, because they wanted to discuss what will be discussed in Switzerland. And now they have reduced that project or that plan to 3 points, apparently. Then I didn't have any confirmation so far, but apparently that's the plan that will be presented or discussed. So you have only 3 points, basically: radiation and nuclear safety. It's about the possible or to prevent destruction of the nuclear power plants. The food security. It's about the traffic of wheat on the Black Sea, and then the release of prisoners and deported persons. That's basically what's left from that.
Okay, but Colonel, this. Try the best you can to peer into the thoughts of these multiple Western European leaders, all the people who are behind this. And at the end of the day, at the end of this conference, for example, what even in their minds is going to say, here's a positive outcome that can lead to either a cessation of the war or even some hypothetical case to where it could help Ukraine win a war? I mean, because I see no possibility of any kind that has some positive outcome for Ukraine that has any impact on the conduct of the war going on the front lines.
But you're absolutely right. And that they start to realize this. The strange thing is that they start to realize it's only now, because yesterday, no, but that's incredible. I mean, yesterday, the Swiss Minister of Defense, this is Mrs. Viola Amert, she is the Swiss Minister of Defense. And she said she's considering having another peace conference. And in this next peace conference, then they would invite Russia. And as of today, the European Union apparently has picked the idea and also plans to have another conference, a peace conference with Russia. Because apparently they have realized exactly what you said, that everything that will be discussed in Bürgenstock, this is mid-June next, in 2 weeks from now, or almost 2 weeks from now, this will lead nowhere. There's absolutely no. They tried to rescue this conference by reducing it to 3 points, but this will not even bring any tangible result. This is just in order to portray this conference as successful. That's all. But in the reality, this will bring absolutely nothing, and they realized it. And even, the Swiss government has invited 160 nations to attend the conference. And at this stage, I don't know, I mean, as per the 15th of May, I don't know the figure as of today, but as of the 15th of May, only 50 countries responded or confirmed. So maybe between 50 and 70. But, we if you look at the map, you will see that these 50 or 70, these will be all pro-Western countries. So basically, we will have exactly the same map as the one we have of those who want to recognize the state of Palestine and things like this. So we see exactly the same divide as the one we have for other issues
Yeah.
currently, I mean, worldwide issues today. So
Here is in fact, if you can do your best to interpret here, this is where Zelensky and Blinken were talking just about, I guess, about a couple of weeks ago, what they said publicly. I wonder if you can translate to the reality behind this. Watch this.
Of course, I want to discuss security guarantees, how our teams work on it, and peace summit, which is very important for us. We need participation, not only United States. We need we need President Biden, and also your help to involve as much as possible countries to peace summit, and I think a lot of things. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Well, Mr. President, thank you very, very much. And first, it's very good to be back in Ukraine. Very good to see you. I bring as well warm greetings from President Biden.
Thank you.
All of us admire your extraordinary resilience, your endurance, your strength, your leadership. And we know this is a challenging time, but we also know that in the near term, the assistance is now on the way. Some of it's already arrived. More of it will be arriving. And that's going to make a real difference against the ongoing Russian aggression on the battlefield. And we're determined, along with many other partners for Ukraine, to make sure that you succeed on the battlefield. We're equally determined that over time, Ukraine stands strongly on its own feet, militarily, economically, democratically. A strong, successful, thriving, free Ukraine is the best possible rebuke to Putin and the best possible guarantor for your future. And for all of that, the United States is and will remain a committed partner.
No, I don't think you can miss the point that you saw. That was the 14th of May when he made that. He was emphatically saying, we need Biden here. You saw the commercial ahead. We need Biden here. You see the headline that Gary put up from today, I think just hours ago. He's still trying to compel Biden to come. I don't know if he's going to succeed, but I don't know that it's going to make any difference.
Well, I think it will not, because again, whatever the situation, whoever attends the conference, at the end of the day, if you want a conference, a peace conference, you need to have the two parties around the table. If otherwise, it's nothing else than a diktat, and that's exactly what will happen. But even if this conference decides on each point and agree on each point, what will force Russia to comply with that? This has absolutely no value for Russia. It has to be signed. I mean, the agreement that was negotiated in March 2022 and that Russia was about to accept was already signed by the Ukrainians. So, meaning that we had an agreement that was signed by the demanding, the requesting party, that was Ukraine. So it was just missing the Russian signature on that to be effective. The problem is that then the West came and prevented that. So meaning that you need to have the signature of both parties on the document. Otherwise, what you say is just wishful thinking.
And you know, that seems self-evident. It shouldn't seem like that should have to be said out loud. But you see, here's what's embarrassing to me. You have contrasted two different things. One is all this stuff we're talking about with the Switzerland and the West writ large, you know, and putting everybody's credibility name on the line. And that's juxtaposed on the other side with, first of all, kind of in the middle, your comment there, which is just really common sense. You can't have a negotiated settlement unless you have the two parties there. But you know who is talking about that? China and Brazil. Here's what they're saying right here. Just a couple of days ago, they're saying that the two sides believe that, and that means China and Brazil, the two sides believe that dialogue and negotiations are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. And then they go on to say that they believe an international peace conference held at the proper time that is recognized by both Russia and Ukraine with equal participation of all parties, as well as a fair discussion of peace plans. These are not, you know, China's or Russia's side trying to say, hey, let's just have some sort of coerced deal that Ukraine just has to give into. They're actually saying what you just did, that this is a rational way to do diplomacy. Explain to me, please, why is it that the West can't act in a balanced way like China?
Well, the problem is that we are just trapped in our narrative. We are just trapped in our narrative. For about 2 years now, we have said that Russia was losing the war. And now we said we don't want to talk to Russia because Putin is a dictator and things like that. And even China, we said the same thing. Even Joe Biden said that Xi Jinping is a dictator. So and now we are just trapped in that kind of narrative that just discards the other countries. And in fact, it's some kind of it's a modern version of the gunboat diplomacy. In fact, this is exactly that. The problem is that, as you said, what we just discussed before is just common sense. The rest of the world, as we call it, or the global south, whatever, these guys, they have common sense. They understand that the West has totally lost its common sense. They understand that the West has lost its credibility. And in fact, everything that we are witnessing today contributes to deepen the divide between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, because the rest of the world perfectly understands these kind of things, and they say, well, you're totally delusional. How can we trust you? And if we add to that the whole economic situation that pushes the West towards the disaster just for the sake of trying to defeat Russia, and the whole thing is totally surrealistic. I mean,
well, we actually had Larry Johnson on talking a similar topic on that just, I guess, a week or so ago. And let's see if you agree with what he said.
Name me one person that's standing up that's either in the Trump sphere or that's in the Biden sphere saying, hey, we need to stop this war. We need to get back to where we're talking to the Russians and we're not calling them our enemy. Think that entire Cold War, even though we had confrontations with the Soviets, we were always talking to them. There were negotiations underway. We came to a variety of arms control agreements. There's none of that going on now. We are treating Russia, who is not a communist country, not an authoritarian dictatorship, as if they are both of those things, and therefore we can't talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the same issue there. Is it because we have this historical bad memory with them now that we can't even talk to them, but no peace is possible until we talk to somebody.
That's absolutely. I mean, Larry Johnson and me have the same background, basically, and we were probably working together at the same time. I mean, in different agencies, obviously, but we were working at the same topic. Namely, so I totally concur with what he says. During the Cold War, we used to talk to we had the START negotiations, we had the INF discussions, we had the conventional force reduction discussions. So we had a lot of talks, and that happened, by the way, in Geneva. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them happened in Geneva. So we were used to talk to each other. And even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had a discussion, you had a dialogue between the US and the Soviets at the time. So why today we have cut all the ties with Russia, and we are not talking about nothing with these guys, because the fact is that we are weaker. You know, when you are strong, you're not afraid to talk to your enemy. But when you are weak, then of course you are afraid. And I think the way we handle this crisis is just an example of of our weakness. It just illustrates our inability to cope with the reality in a sensible manner. We are just unable to grasp the reality, to understand that the reality is the reality. We don't need to invent a reality, but what we are doing, because we are so weak, then we have to invent a reality that doesn't exist.
Well, and that's I think that trying to create a reality is I mean, just digging ourselves deeper. And here's another great example of it. Unfortunately, that I have to show here is you had a senior U.S. Congressional member recently try to make the case that we are handcuffing Ukraine, and if only we would take the handcuffs off, man, things would be much better. Check this out.
We have a really bad situation going on, as you know. This is a sanctuary zone that the Russians have created. And what they're doing is they're lining up all their artillery and rockets and missiles just across the Ukraine border that they then use to attack the Ukrainians. However, your administration and Jake Sullivan have restricted the arms use so that Ukraine cannot defend itself and fire back at Russia. That's why I mandated the ATACMS and the supplemental, the long range, short range, and the HIMARS, that your administration is tying their hands behind their back, not unlike what you're trying to do in Israel. Will you change this policy so Ukraine can fight without one hand tied behind its back?
Okay, first of all, what the hell is he talking about? Because Ukraine is firing left and right for months into Russia. They've been hitting Belgorod. They've been hitting the energy infrastructure all over Russia. They've been doing sabotage operations within the country. And here in the last few days, they've actually attacked two nuclear weapons radar systems, which is a pretty scary thing because Russia could take, real concern about that, because that could limit their ability to see incoming nuclear warheads against them. And I don't know for sure what they're going to do about that. But there's a lot of attacks going on within Russia right now. So what is he talking about with this kind of thing that we're handcuffing them?
Well, the interesting thing is that these guys seems totally unable to understand the consequences of addressing the Russian territory. I mean, there are a lot of activities the West has done without understanding that the Russians don't want to have a World War III. They have as an objective to demilitarize Ukraine, to demilitarize the threat against the Russian population in Ukraine. That was the name of the game at the beginning. Today, of course, this situation has evolved in a Clausewitzian manner. Now they say they want to demilitarize Ukraine. But demilitarizing Ukraine doesn't mean that it's a physical demilitarization. It could be a demilitarization through an agreement, as Zelensky provided for in March 2022. So that could be a solution. The problem is that today Zelensky is no longer credible. First of all, because the Russians say, well, he's no longer the president of Ukraine, meaning that if we sign something with him, will the new government recognize this or not? This is the kind of a legal void there, and that's one of the problems. And the other problem is, of course, that since now up to now, the West has always short-circuited the decision of the Ukrainian government. So meaning that even if you sign an agreement today, you don't know if tomorrow this agreement will be agreed upon by the West or implemented or respected by the West. And that's the next problem. But the thing is that the Russians never wanted to have a big war. And because the West is pushing Ukraine, because for the Russians, as I said, the objective was to demilitarize the threat against the population, the Russian population. But for the West, the name of the game is not to help Russia, is to destroy Russia. The name of the game for the West is not to help Ukraine, but to destroy or to make Russia to collapse. So, meaning that for the Russians, they are very careful about what the West and others are doing within Russia, because that could be the sign for something more important and even more dramatic for the country. I mean, I have. You may remember that there was this objective that was stated. You find it on the State Department website. I have to find it back, but this was this idea that the Russia must be splitted into different countries. I mean, what is called the decolonization of Russia. And I have to find it so I can show you the map, but that's the map that was proposed to the. Oh, sorry, I don't. Oh, that's here. So here we can see it. So so the Russians see all the threat against their territory with a total different eyes as we do, because they see that there is an idea in the West to make Russia to collapse. And this project of decolonizing Russia, it's come, by the way, from the website of the State Department. So it's not something I just invented. And you had several conferences in recently on that, at least 6, and there is a 7th one that will be in Vienna in early June. So in a few days from now, about decolonizing Russia. That means decomposing, kind of balkanization of Russia into nation states. So that means,
I was totally unaware of this. I've never seen that before.
well, that's a very important thing, and one of the conferences was held in the one in January 2023 was held in the building of the Parliament in the EU Parliament in Brussels. So we are not talking about just a few discussions between a few marginal individuals, and no, this is a policy. And by the way, recently the Prime Minister of Estonia, Mrs. Kaja Kallas, just said exactly that. They said what we need is a Russia that is decomposed in different states. So this is an official policy that we have in the United States that is conducted towards Russia. And of course, the Russians see all these threats against their territory with extremely. They look at this very seriously.
Well, and let me just show you how seriously. So, a couple of things. This first one here is from February, where Putin said this very emphatically himself, not through some deputy or Lavrov or anybody else. This is what he himself said in February.
They must ultimately understand that we also have weapons, and they know about it. Just as I said, we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory. All of this really threatens conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand this?
I don't know that we do. And in fact, I know for sure that many of our biggest proponents, like General Hodges, General Keane, several others on television, I've heard plenty of people in the Congress say it. They don't believe it. They say, oh, don't worry about that, because he understands, meaning Putin, that if he did anything, we would have this big strike. You had the foreign minister of Poland, Sikorski, a couple of days ago said the U.S. has told him that if they use a nuclear weapon anywhere, even a tactical one that doesn't kill anyone, that the U.S. is coming after them. Do these people truly not understand you're talking about World War III there?
Well, that's exactly, and that's not new, by the way. On the very first day of the Russian military operation, the French defense minister threatened Russia with nuclear use of weapons by NATO, and he said that in fact to the. I can show you. This is sorry. Here we go. So the nuclear threat was already on the 24th of February, and in in August 2022, Liz Truss said she was ready to hit the nuclear button, and she was even risking the total nuclear global annihilation to fight the Russia. So we are with individuals or leaders in Europe that are totally irresponsible. And we can even go further, because in March 2023, you had US bombers, B-52 bombers, that were sent from Spain to fly over Estonia and to simulate an attack of St. Petersburg with nuclear weapons. That was tracked by these, I don't remember the name, is Live Raiders or something like that. And they tracked this, the path of this B-52 bomber. So, we have, we have indicated to the Russians that in fact, we are contemplating the idea of using weapons. Well, the response, the Russian response to this, this very last, this incident in March 23, is that Vladimir Putin announced that he would deploy or station, better said, nuclear weapons in Belarus. And that was, in fact, this decision of deploying non-strategic nuclear weapons to Belarus was a response to that provocation by the US in the Gulf of Finland, by simulating this nuclear attack. So we have leaders that are totally unaware of the possible consequences of what they are doing. And I would say these guys are, in fact, it's almost as is of our leadership was kind of playing an electronic game on a computer. They are not, they don't seem to be aware of the possible consequences on the population, not even on the Ukrainian ones, by the way, because as Lindsey Graham and other guys said, that basically Ukraine is a good way to fight Russia without spending the life of Americans. So, as suggesting that the Ukrainian lives
don't matter.
Matter.
Now, in the last few minutes that we have here, Colonel, I want to ask you kind of a scary question, because I'm not sure how you're going to answer it. I'm going to show you a clip of Professor John Mearsheimer where he lays out what I think you'll at least come close to agreeing with is what we should do right now, given all the things that have happened, all the conditions that exist on the ground. He's going to lay out what he argues that we should do. But I'm going to ask you what you think we will do, say, in the coming in the short and near term. So first, check this out. John, we have boxed ourselves into a corner. Now I don't know how to get out of this. What should we do? How can we take this mess right now and get it fixed?
Well, there's only one possible solution. And I want to underline the word possible, because it's not clear it would work, but it's the only game in town, in my opinion. And that is, we do everything we can to shut down the war immediately. And we go to great lengths to create a neutral Ukraine. We get the Ukrainians to make it clear to the Russians that they have no intention of joining NATO. They will be a neutral state, and they will go to great lengths not to pursue a security policy that threatens Russia in any way. And then the second thing that needs to be done is that the security relationship between the United States and Ukraine has to be completely ended.
So I think you probably agree, or maybe you do. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that seems like a pretty rational, possible way to get out. But I want to know what you think, best case, we will do, the West.
Well, I think the problem, what we will do, is difficult to answer because I tend to think rationally and our leaders tend to think irrationally. So,
Right?
yeah, it's very difficult for me to
To
put the
think
shoes
irrationally on purpose? Yeah, I get it.
of our leaders. But I think Professor Mersheimer is absolutely right. Now we have to stop this conflict and to come back. And in fact, Vladimir Putin said in his press conference in Belarus that they were ready to take some aspect of the deal that was almost signed with Ukraine in March 2022. And notably, what he had in mind most probably was the neutralization of Ukraine, which will not be something very exotic for Ukraine, because if you look at the constitution of Ukraine, I mean, the 1991 constitution of Ukraine, it was already stated that Ukraine should not have foreign troops on its territory and that Ukraine should not sign treaties that would be against Russia. So this idea, although the word neutrality is not used in that constitution, the idea of a kind of a neutral Ukraine was in the air in that constitution. So it shouldn't be something totally exotic to resurrect in such an agreement. But I think, I totally concur with Professor Morsheimer. The problem is, there are two problems. The first is that the West now doesn't want to lose face. And what we are witnessing now with all these declaration of Jens Stoltenberg saying that it's not too late for Ukraine to prevail. I don't know where it gets that from, but that's what he said just recently.
Yeah.
All these kind of things is in fact a way of trying to avoid to lose face. That's the exercise of the West. That's the first problem. The second problem is that if a deal is signed between Ukraine and Russia, we have to make sure that this agreement should be credible for the Russians. The Russians don't trust the West and don't trust Ukraine anymore because they have been deceived in the recent attempts to have a deal. And today they will be very cautious. That means that we need to have not just security guarantee for Ukraine, but also security guarantees for Russia. And I think that's what the Russians will ask for. That's the difficulty we have now. We have been so much playing with the Russians that today they will not trust us anymore.
And I think that it's exacerbated by the fact that our mentality still can't disentangle an intent and a desire for Russia to lose. And even the contemplation, even saying the words out loud you just did, that Russia will have to have something that it can trust on the other side, or that we have to do something that in any way is a positive for Russia, is just anathema to the West, that they won't even concede it. But in the last question I want to ask you is, if that pervades, if that continues on to where we can't contemplate what you just said and can't even allow anything to be drafted up that would have that kind of a net result, what happens to Ukraine? Because my fear is that if we continue with the fiction and the preference, that all we're doing is going to condemn Ukraine to eventually a collapse of the military. Do you see it any other way?
Well, if there is an agreement, a pattern on the model that was designed in March 2022, we could have Ukraine with an army, but a neutral army. I mean, Switzerland.
Right. No, I agree. I'm just saying if we don't agree to that, and just keep fighting.
If we keep fighting, then that will be clear. I mean, the Russians will just destroy Ukraine, and probably some countries like Poland, like Hungary, they will try that. Some have suggested, by the way, that Poland or Hungary could try to get back some territories. I mean, the Hungarian may take back Transcarpathia, and the Poles could get back Galicia, and then Ukraine could factually disappear. just factually. They will be absorbed in pieces by other countries. That's the fate of Ukraine. But what the Russians will manage to do is to destroy all the military, all the industrial capacities, the economy. Maybe if they take Odessa, for instance, that means that Ukraine has no access to the sea, meaning that only and if you look at the pattern of industry in Ukraine, you will see that most of the industrial capacities of Ukraine were in fact on what is today into Russian territory, in fact, and Odessa. And if you remove everything that is on the Black Sea, when you remove that to Ukraine, Ukraine is powerless.
A vassal state, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that will be the end, or Ukraine will be a very poor country. But if we look at the demographic evolution of Ukraine since 1991, Ukraine has only lost individuals. They have emigrated, they have been scattered throughout Europe, and this will continue. And at the end, if there is no possible economic activities in Ukraine, people will just leave, and this country will just die by itself. I think that's unfortunately where Europe is pushing Ukraine to.
That's exactly what I see. I mean, we saw it in Stoltenberg's comment I showed earlier today, where we want this long-term thing. We just want to keep the fiction going on long-term, even though I don't think their army can stay that long, and it's going to condemn Ukraine to a likelihood, in my view, of a military defeat. But we'll see what happens over the time. Listen, we really appreciate you coming on and providing so much clarity for this and a lot of your experience and knowledge about things I didn't even know before we started this. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. That's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we'll definitely keep tracking on this, and we'll come back to you, I'm sure, very soon on and what things happen in the next issue here. Join us back this afternoon at 3 p.m. I'm going to have a special episode here called "The Three Dangers for Ukraine in Russia's Northern Axis." So when they're coming in this part in the north of Kharkiv, I'm going to explain militarily what is the three possibilities that the Russians could be doing there, because you have a lot of misinformation or just lack of knowledge about a lot of people claiming that they know. I'm going to show you what are some of the legit, no kidding possibilities for what Russia's trying to accomplish there. I also want to alert you that here in the coming days, we're going to announce something that we're really excited about here at Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And that is the opening of a new exclusive opportunity for you as the viewers to actually engage directly with us in a special sort of way. We've always said from the beginning that, we're all in this together. And, I comment about how watch a lot of these the comments that are going on, and we include them when we can. But we're going to give you an exclusive offer to join with us in a special kind of closed area where you get special, unique input. You get special offerings and different videos that are just for the folks who sign up for this and become members of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army, is I think what we're calling it right now. And that we'll be able to physically interact with text messages so that you can share your ideas and we can bounce things off each other. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just be on the lookout. It's coming very soon, and you'll not want to miss that. Thank you very much for joining with us today, and we'll see you at 3 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.